Serial killers. They both fascinate and frighten in equal measure. We cannot help but be curious about what possesses these people to do the unspeakable. From Dr. Henry Howard Holmes to Harold Shipman, there spans a plethora of these psychotics spanning centuries. It is ingrained within our DNA to be attracted to the dark side of humanity, however much we feign disgust. We read their stories and queue up to watch the real-life monsters portrayed on the silver screen. We cannot ignore the power these figures have on us during or after their active time. For a lot of people, in the midst of it all, the ones on our list appeared normal. Some were confident and outgoing, some shy and reclusive. They walk like us and talk like us, but they are different on the inside. There appears to be no one type, and that is truly disturbing. They could literally be anyone. If caught, the inevitable interest from the media is applied, and their every move is published, aired and sought after, right to the end. But this fascination does not end at their death, and even the quiet and unassuming among us cannot help but take a peek at their last moments. On viewing these photographs, you may be forgiven as seeing them as human beings, but do not be fooled, for there lies within a monster. Here are 5 last ever photographs of serial killers. Ted Bundy. You're all probably aware of the story of Theodore Robert Bundy, an American serial killer who murdered and assaulted an unknown number of young women and girls in the 1970s. If you're unfamiliar with Ted, then you can watch our Murderous Minds documentary on him. What was unusual about Bundy was that he didn't look like a serial killer. He was handsome and charismatic, and many of the women he murdered couldn't see past that persona, and those that did realised too late. He was also very sure of himself, and during his trial, despite being faced with overwhelming evidence, he still pleaded not guilty and remained cocky and calculated throughout, showing no remorse for his victims or their families. In fact, he often appeared cheerful and upbeat in photos taken by the press, and for the most part, he handled his own defence so that he could be in control. However, ultimately Bundy was convicted and sentenced to death. Shortly before his execution, and after more than a decade of denials, he finally confessed to 30 murders. However, the real number of victims is unknown and is likely much higher. On the 24th of January 1989, Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. The photographs that were released just before and after his death showed a very different Bundy. Gone was the cockiness, smiles and good looks. These were replaced with an ashed face, shaven-headed man with his head bowed, trembling with fear. His last words before his execution were, "Jim and Fred, I'd like to give my love to my family and friends." Jim was one of his lawyers, and Fred was a Methodist minister who had spent the last night with Bundy in prayer. After which, a last thick strap was pulled across his mouth and chin, the metal skull cap was bolted in place, and an anonymous executioner pushed the button. 2,000 volts surged through the wires, and Bundy's body tensed, and his hands tightened, and a tiny puff of smoke lifted from his right leg. At 7:16 a.m, Theodore Robert Bundy, one of the most heinous killers of all time, was pronounced dead. This last picture was taken immediately after his death. As haunting as it is, there are many that believe Bundy had a far easier death than his many victims, and after doing extensive research on his crimes, I have to agree. Jeffrey Dahmer. The obvious comparison between Dahmer and Bundy is that they were both serial killers of the most heinous kind. Both were necrophiliacs, and both killed for sexual gratification. But there is another similarity. They were both good-looking, charming men, who held down jobs, and to the outside world would have been considered normal. However, after Dahmer was caught on July the 22nd, 1991, unlike Bundy, he readily admitted to his crimes, and almost casually described how he killed, violated, dismembered, and ate his victims. In interviews he gave to the media after his conviction, he spoke easily and matter-of-factly about his compulsion to kill. But unlike Bundy, Dahmer escaped the death sentence, although his reputation and crimes meant he signed his own death warrant when he was sent to a tough state prison after being found to be sane at the time of his murders. And on the morning of November the 28th, 1994, Dahmer was bludgeoned to death by fellow prisoner Christopher Scarver while on a work assignment in the prison gym showers. Dahmer was discovered on the floor of the bathrooms, suffering from severe head and facial wounds, He had been savagely beaten with a 20-inch metal bar, and his head had also been repeatedly struck against the wall. Dahmer died shortly after, and one of the last photographs of him shows him with his head caved in, still in his prison overalls, led on a trolley. Later, another photo was released of his cleaned-up corpse lying in the morgue. Few tears would have been shed over his demise, with many believing it was a fitting end to such a monstrous killer. Charles Manson. We've never talked much about Charles Manson, although I'm sure that will be remedied in the future. He was an infamous cult leader and rock star wannabe, who held a firm grip over his followers, and from a deserted ranch in the San Fernando Valleys, his devout followers would bow to his every whim. From petty car crimes to robbery, the cult would eventually murder 8 people, all on the orders of Charles Manson. One of those victims was a pregnant Hollywood star called Sharon Tate, who was married to Hollywood director Roman Polanski. She died, along with 4 others, in a crime that shook Hollywood to its core. All parties were ultimately captured, and Manson was keen to be the centre of attention throughout the court proceedings. With his followers lining the streets and filling the courtroom, it was a media circus. Manson was convicted and sentenced to the death penalty, despite never actually killing any of the victims. However, due to a change in policy in 1972, this was changed to life imprisonment. Manson remained in prison for the rest of his life, and on the 19th of November 2017, he died of a heart attack and complications from colon cancer. This is the last photograph of Charles Manson. Gone is the bravado and good looks, replaced with a withered old man waiting to die. Ed Gein. If you've watched our Murderous Minds documentary on Ed Gein, you'll know he is an altogether different character to the first 3. He was an oddball. His chaotic upbringing and obsession with his mother drove him to exhume corpses from local graveyards and use their bones and skin to create keepsakes that he adorned his home with. Now technically, he was not a serial killer, as he was only convicted of killing 2 people, although it's likely he killed more. But what made him so notorious was what he did with the corpses of those that he did kill, along with the recently deceased middle-aged woman he exhumed from graveyards. It's thought it was his macabre way of trying to recreate his dead mother. Unlike the previous 3, Gein was deemed to be insane, and so was mentally incompetent to stand trial. Instead, he was initially sent to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane, now the Dodge Correctional Institution, a maximum security facility in Wisconsin, and was later transferred to the Mendota State Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. Unlike most criminals, Gein thrived in this clean and cared-for environment, and pictures of him before and after his arrest show a much improved and healthier appearance. This newfound life enabled Gein to live to the ripe old age of 77, before he eventually died on July 26, 1984, due to respiratory failure secondary to lung cancer. For years before his death, Gein had not been seen in public, and this photograph is thought to be the last of him, taken 2 months before he died, and it shows how frail he had become. There is no doubt that Gein was a twisted and sick man, but to this day, there is a morbid fascination with him that has a lasting effect on American popular culture, and this is evidenced by his numerous appearances in films, music, and literature. John Wayne Gacy. We have touched on Gacy's crimes in a couple of videos, and there are plans to do a Murderous Minds documentary on him in the near future. But for now, here is just a tiny outline of his background and crimes. John Wayne Gacy Jr. was born on the 17th of March 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, the first of 3 children to John Stanley Gacy and Marian Robinson. Gacy claims he was beaten up and verbally abused by his father and was also sexually molested by a family friend. At 18, Gacy left the family home and fled to Las Vegas, Nevada, where he worked as a paramedic and a mortuary assistant for 3 years before returning to Chicago, where he eventually married and moved to Iowa. Gacy was, however, a closet homosexual and was plagued by sadistic thoughts. Starting in August 1967, he began to sexually assault young males by plying them with alcohol before forcing them to perform sexual acts on him. He was later charged for these offences and was convicted and ordered to serve 10 years in prison, although in the end he only served 18 months. At the time, his then wife filed for divorce and he never saw his children again. In 1971, after returning to Chicago on parole, Gacy was again charged with sexually assaulting a boy. However, his victim failed to attend the trial, and in a shocking oversight, the Iowa Board of Parole failed to hear about the incident. 8 months later, Gacy's parole was lifted. He then moved on to reside at 8213 Summerdale Avenue. He remarried and began a construction business which became very lucrative. He was a well-known figure in the community and would hold summer parties at his house. He was also active in the politics of the Democratic Party, and in a chilling twist, he also performed as a clown at children's parties. Between 1972 and 1978, during the time he lived here, he raped, tortured, and murdered 33 teenage boys and men. Most of the bodies were buried under the family house. However, he also dumped bodies in the Des Plaines River off a bridge called the I-55. It was the murder of Robert Priest which finally led to his capture. He was last to see Robert before he went missing, and after being questioned by police, his story was inconsistent with other witnesses. Checks were carried out in regards to his criminal past, and his premises were searched. Initially, nothing was found, but after being put under surveillance, Gacy eventually confessed to the murders to his lawyer before being arrested by police. Once arrested, he made a full confession. In 1980, Gacy was sentenced to death, but it would be a further 14 years before the execution was carried out. During this time, Gacy started painting, and although he painted a variety of subjects, most of his paintings were of clowns. One of the last chilling photographs of Gacy was taken a few days before his death, when he is being held in the death chamber. It depicts a very different man than the smiling clown of old. The second photo is thought to be Gacy on his way to the execution chamber. In a final act of defiance and blatant disregard for his victims, Gacy's last words before the lethal injection was administered were "Kiss my ass."